It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George, and thank you, John Schaefer, for that outstanding introduction. That's his big booming voice. And he's got a great broadcast voice. His dad's a legend here in the Midwest as far as broadcasting is concerned. Here's another booming, great voice. Listen to this.
We'll bring you details now, more details on the attempted assassination of President Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy was on her knees, we're told, on the floor of the rear seat of the car, her head toward the president, apparently leaning over and trying to converse with him. AP reporter who was with the group said that this man and woman we reported earlier were on a hilltop, were seen scrambling to the upper level of a walkway overlooking an underpass to which the car was approaching. Lawrence O'Brien, the presidential aide, says he has no information on whether the president is still alive. Mrs. Kennedy was weeping, trying to hold up her husband's head when the reporters reached the car as it dashed toward the hospital.
And of course, we know who that is. That is the great Walter Cronkite. Rest in peace. And, a great deal of his success, I really always thought had to do with the timbre and tone of his voice and his delivery. The way the guy could put together words was outstanding. And those are some of the most historic, memorable words in the history of American broadcasting. November 22nd, 1963. We're getting close to that day. And I know it just from the weather, just from the time of year almost, because it's a big deal with me. I remember it. I was a young lad, only in third grade, but I remember exactly that day. And today we're going to have our podcast by George, a live line lit up with a couple of my favorite guests. I hope you saw the promo, the JFK Assassination 60th anniversary. There's a new bombshell, or maybe not, just another dud perhaps, but it has to do with what you see in the graphic there, what a lot of people refer to as the magic bullet. Now, we're going to get to that, but I also want to do an introduction here for our guest. Joining us right off the top is Gerald Posner, the award-winning journalist and author, Pulitzer finalist. He's a merciless pit bull of an investigator. That's according to the Chicago Tribune. He's written 13 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, Case Closed, Why America Slept, God's Bankers, and Pharma. We've talked about that on the show, which is kind of a pharmaceutical version of Cops and Robbers, according to the New York Times. Now, follow Gerald, and I'm going to put these URLs up on screen. The best way to keep track of his stuff, I think, is on Substack. And it's substack.com, of course, but then it's just at Posner. We're going to have those addresses up on the screen. And then also joining us here very shortly will be Laura Belin. She's the editor of Bleeding Heartland, a community blog providing original reporting and commentary about Iowa politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social and governmental, environmental issues. And of course, she is also the daughter of the great David Belin. Let's say rest in peace for him also, one of the Warren Commission attorneys. And we're going to be talking about that as well. But let me put that away. Let me take this off the screen here, click a couple of buttons, and say good morning to our guests. Let me see if I can get, there they are. I can see a couple of them now. Let me add Gerald in there. He's down there. Gerald, you're in Florida?
I am indeed in Miami Beach.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us on the podcast by George live line today. Let me see here. And I see Laura has already joined. There she is. Hi, Laura Belin.
Good to see you.
Laura.
Yeah. I know Gerald always enjoys having Laura on the show. I mean, that's a real blast from the past. That is a connection to history. But let me get to this, guys. I want to get this thing rolling here because we always run out of time when we're talking to Gerald. This is from his Substack that I mentioned. And it reads, an explosive JFK assassination tale from a retired Secret Service agent. Now, a lot of people may have seen the headline to this, but they didn't look into it very closely. It reads, everyone interested in the JFK assassination, and boy am I, has focused for years on the dwindling number of files still sealed at the National Archives. Many longtime researchers hope that revelations in those documents would provide big news for the upcoming 60th anniversary of the murder this November. It's next week. the 60th anniversary. Now, it turns out the development that will have assassination researchers buzzing was published in a New York Times article by veteran reporter Peter Baker. The startling new claims about the case come from a person, not something retrieved from old files. Okay, let me click a couple of buttons here because I want to get Gerald in here right away to talk about this, because I've even gotten a query today, people talking about the archives. But I remember talking to you earlier, Gerald, that you really haven't seen much come out of these archives. And I kind of got the sense that you were getting pessimistic that anything ever would. And this did not.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We still have files to get out of the archives. We're still finding out with every release how little those documents have to do with the actual assassination of JFK, and how much they have to do with the CIA protecting resources or names or operations that were embarrassing decades after the fact. So those files have proved so far a disappointment. We still have about 4,000 that in some cases only have one word redacted, but we're still waiting for those. And you're right, coming into the 60th anniversary, that's what we were all talking about and looking at. And now, from out of left field, comes an eyewitness account, a little bit late, but an eyewitness account nevertheless. There's no question he was there. He is Paul Landis. He's getting to be 90 years old. He was a young Secret Service agent on the backup car, the president, and he recounts for the first time publicly in a new book a rather remarkable story about finding a whole bullet in the limousine when it's at Parkland Hospital, taking that bullet and putting it into his pocket, and then later depositing it. First, he says on JFK stretcher, and then he says maybe it was another stretcher, but on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Now, the question becomes, with Landis, memories are foggy, and he prompted me so much to write something about this. I didn't just write about it in Substack. I've updated Case Closed for the first time in 20 years with a new afterword that addresses Landis. I have found out that he actually told the story for the first time in 2014 to a fellow agent, Clint Hill, who most of your listeners will know is the Secret Service agent that reacted that day and threw himself on the back of the limousine and helped Mrs. Kennedy get back into the cars. It was zooming out of Dealey Plaza and then hung on for dear life at high speeds to Parkland Hospital. Landis told Hill in 2014 the story that he had picked up a bullet. Now, it's amazing because he'd given two contemporaneous long written statements to the investigators in the case immediately after the assassination, within days. He never mentions the bullet. He mentions seeing a fragment at one point, but that's the end of it. Now he tells the story about the bullet for the first time. And my feeling on it is, and I've talked to memory experts, I've talked to people who deal with memory and witnesses, people's memory change over time. There's no question about that, especially on these so-called flashbulb events, 9/11, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Challenger. We hear the news, and we remember in our brain where we were and what we were doing and some events around it on that day. And then over time, we talk to other witnesses, we see documentaries, we read books. That becomes part of our memories, and we could pass a lie detector test about the accuracy of it, but it's not a real memory. Now, in the case of Landis, I do not believe it's possible to forget something as dramatic as picking up a whole bullet on the day that the person you're charged to protect has been murdered. You either are remembering that forever and it's seared into your brain, and for whatever reason you didn't disclose it early on, or it's concocted. And although Landis hasn't spoken to me, everyone that I've spoken to has interviewed him, like Peter Baker at the Times. They are convinced that he's 100% sincere. They don't think he's a charlatan. He's not somebody out to make a fast dollar. He's not somebody who's making a big thing. So I think that Landis is likely telling the truth about finding that bullet. And then the question we can discuss later is, what does it mean for the case? But I'll tell you one thing I know, and I won't speak for Laura, but her father, as one of the chief lawyers on the case looking into it, they would have been horrified, I think, that something like this happened. It's such a dereliction of duty that you would find it. The time to have investigated it was 60 years ago, when we could have actually found out what happened. Now we'll always be left with a little bit of doubt.
Well, let me jump in here and say this. Again, I'm the curmudgeon of the group. Probably I'm the cynic, but I look at these people and I look at that Dallas thing and the assassination, and I'm not seeing any deep, dark conspiracy with shadowy figures. By and large, I'm seeing massive incompetence and screw ups, including this Landis reporting that just came out. We're discovering that the secret, or maybe I'm sure that Gerald knew this, but those Secret Service guys were all at an all night cabaret the night before the Kennedy assassination. I'm like, what? You guys, one of them didn't even get to bed that night. Oswald, one of the very few people in America that ever defected to Russia, for God's sake, had a job in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository on the motorcade route, and nobody did anything. And then this Landis dude, like a teenager, really picked up this bullet and then just kind of stuck it on a gurney and walked away and didn't say anything until he was an old man getting ready to die, and he's selling a book. I don't know, Gerald, Laura, tell me that I'm being too cynical looking at this thing.
Well, I don't know. Obviously, my father would have really wanted to investigate at the time. I mean, talk about mishandling evidence. There were a lot of things that were mishandled about the initial investigation. And I know this was something, Gerald, I think it was actually in Philip Sheenan's book, A Cruel and Shocking Act, that was about how the Warren Commission, when they went down to Dallas, there were just basic things that the Dallas police had not investigated. There were eyewitnesses to the Tippit murder who had never been interviewed. There were just, I mean, there were ear witnesses in the school book depository building. I mean, they were testing, the Warren Commission staff were needing to test things like, could someone have run down the stairwell from the 6th floor in the amount of time? And, these were just basic investigative processes that hadn't happened. So, I mean, it is rather horrifying to think that a Secret Service agent could have found a bullet and picked up a bullet and transferred it and not mentioned it to anybody at the time. That would have been really important to know, obviously. I mean, I do remember there was a different Secret Service agent whose his testimony became the fodder for one of the conspiracy books, because he testified that after the first shot was fired, that he heard the president say, "My God, I've been hit," or something like that, which of course couldn't have happened if, under the Warren Commission's reconstruction of events, the first bullet went through the president's windpipe and he wouldn't have been able to make any sound. And the other people in the car, Jackie Kennedy, the other Secret Service agents, John Connolly and Mrs. Connolly, did not hear the president say anything. So my father's perspective on that was not that this Secret Service agent was making it up, that he had some kind of a memory. Maybe he heard somebody say, "My God, he's been hit," or maybe he was even thinking, "My God, he's been hit." And it became a memory of hearing the president say, "My God, I've been hit." So again, a lot of people can remember things differently, even people who were observing the same scene at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I do think, I had an interview the other day, the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas. We'll have it on later this month. I sort of led some questions with Clint Hill, and Lisa McCutcheon, who's his wife, who's written the book with him. They've updated Clint Hill's book on the case. And he said that something I hadn't thought of. He said after the assassination, this was an era in which none of us got any counseling. Nobody thought of PTSD. He said we were all sort of suffering from some type of shock. He said he ended up in a very frank discussion. He said, years later, by the time I left the Secret Service, they let me go. He said, I was drinking. I was trying to mask what had happened. And so somebody like Landis, who ends up leaving a few years later, not long afterwards, who had been assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, he says he didn't follow the case very carefully. He sort of, stayed away from it. He didn't know the details. But on that day, you have to think that here's a guy who's 29 years old. If he sees a bullet, he takes it. And in the new version, what I call his book version, the one that's out, he says that he got sort of shoved into the room in which Jack Kennedy was being treated on feverishly by doctors at Parkland. There's some doubt about that being correct. And that he put the bullet onto JFK stretcher because that's where it belonged. He thought it should be with the president. That may make him feel better about having left the bullet on an empty stretcher at Parkland Hospital, because he sort of put it poetically with JFK. I believe that what he said, in fact, to Clint Hill 9 years ago was that as they were leaving Parkland, getting ready to go back to DC, he dropped it on a stretcher on the way out of the hospital, figuring it would be found there. Pretty bad way to do it. But it explains something, as Laura knows and George knows. The so-called the single bullet, the so-called magic bullet, according to Oliver Stone, the bullet that your father worked very hard on, Laura, the bullet that went through Jack Kennedy and Governor Conley, that was found as it fell off a stretcher at Parkland Hospital when the chief engineer, walking about an hour and a half after the Secret Service had left the hospital, bumped into a stretcher and knocked it off. There were two stretchers there, and he couldn't remember which one he bumped into. One, it turned out, belonged to Governor Conley, been used to rush the governor into the hospital. Governor was taken off of that stretcher and put on the operating table. Then it was brought down to that hallway. The second stretcher belonged to a young kid who had been brought into the emergency while all of this was playing out. Neither was Jack Kennedy's stretcher. Mm-hmm. And so the Warren Commission assumed logically the surgeon who did the work on Conley to save his life looked at the wound in his thigh and knew it was a superficial wound, that the bullet had popped out, and actually sent somebody in the operating room to look for the bullet. They didn't look on the stretcher. They didn't find it, but he knew that somehow it had come out of Conley. The Warren Commission assumed it probably popped out on the stretcher that Conley was brought in on. That makes sense. But I now believe that is very likely that we have the answer as to how it got on that stretcher by the account of Paul Landis. He dropped it on a stretcher as he was leaving the hospital. And 60 years later, he's too embarrassed to say he didn't put it on JFK stretcher. He just dropped it on a stretcher he didn't know who it belonged to.
Yeah, let me ask you this. This is a question I've really been wanting to ask you, because I had a Jose Vega. He's a dissident in New York City. He wanted to talk about the Kennedy assassination. And Gerald, he admitted most of his perspective and information comes from the JFK movie. I mean, that's how he knows about the Kennedy assassination. But I told him, among the many things that I told him during the show, I said, if there was something more to this Kennedy assassination after 60 years, and he's a big fan of Seymour Hersh because of his reporting on Nord Stream 2 and that type of thing. But I said, Seymour Hersh would have told you. I said, the other thing of it is Gerald Posner would tell you. He would know. And now I'm kind of looking like I got a little bit of egg on my face, because this is a startling revelation. But on the other side of the coin, from your perspective and from a journalism perspective, it's somewhat meaningless. Am I correct in that from your view or not?
So I don't think it's meaningless in the sense that it's a footnote story. It becomes, it answers the question for me of how the bullet ended up on the stretcher. So yes, the commission assumed that it had popped out of Conley's thigh and ended up on his stretcher, but it might have been left by Landis either on Conley's stretcher or the one next door, which belonged to the young guy. And then when the chief engineer bumps into one of them, it drops to the floor. And since it's the bullet that ties ballistically to Oswald's gun and also then links to Conley with genetic material and everything else, we all assume it's from Conley's stretcher. It might or might not be. It was just left on a hospital stretcher in the hallway by Landis. Is it a terrible dereliction of duty? Absolutely. Is it a complete break in the chain of evidence? Could a defense lawyer at the time, like a Mark Lane, have made hay out of it in a trial of Lee Harvey Oswald? 1,000%. But in terms of history, I think it gives us a little bit of an answer as to how that bullet. There's no way the Warren Commission and could have figured out that a Secret Service agent was responsible for depositing the so-called single bullet Commission Exhibit 399 on a stretcher in the hallway.
Yeah, I got to admit, I did a head snap. I did a jaw drop when I saw this, and I wondered what else there was to it. But then I read into it, and I thought, well, and I thought that term that you used, Gerald, flashbulb memory, or I thought about maybe that was taking effect here, because Landis, he was very specific about putting this on Kennedy's gurney, down by his feet or something like that. Is that a flashbulb memory? Is it worse than that? Is he just adding these details to sell books? I mean, yeah.
No. So I think what happens is, this is in this discussion I have with these memory people, the basic underlying event is either real or not. You either were at a scene, you were here at that location, you were talking to somebody, or in this case, you're taking the bullet. False or true? So if I give them the benefit of the doubt and say that's true, then the part that becomes troublesome for the memory people is all of the details around it. Where exactly do you find it in the car? How do you remember that? It's like Laura saying before about the Secret Service agent who remembers Kennedy saying something when that was impossible. Where did you deposit it once you went in all the high drama of that day? And this isn't just conjecture. After the Challenger discovery had blown up, the Challenger mishap, a group of memory experts in Wisconsin went out of the university and they gathered a couple of hundred students and they said to them 3 questions. Where were you when you heard about it? What time was it when you were told, and who told you? Then they went back to them a couple of years later. It's not surprising that about half of them remembered one or another of the 3 things differently. Here's the part that's amazing. When the researchers showed them their original statements, about half of that group said, what I told you originally has to be wrong, because I know what I'm telling you now is right. So the new memories not only come into our head, but they become as real as facts. You can pass a lie detector test and they're real. So maybe that's how Landis remembers it today, but you're rolling the dice as to whether all those extraneous details are correct. There are 2 parts of this that either he's making up or it's truthful. He found a bullet and where he left it when he was leaving, because those are 2 things in the life of an agent you can't forget. You want to talk about the details on what specific stretcher and what time and what Mrs. Kennedy was saying? Boy, I'll tell you, you might as well, just throw a dart at a board and hope it's accurate.
I mean, it's shocking to me that he found a bullet in the car and didn't put that in the statement that he submitted at the time. I mean, surely the Warren Commission would have interviewed him if anything like that had been in his statement. So that, to me, was the most surprising thing. And I don't know why he would leave that out of the statement unless he was embarrassed that he didn't follow the proper chain of custody for evidence procedures or something. I can't really, that's the part that makes the least sense to me.
Laura, I think that he had locked himself in by the time he left the hospital. Once you've abandoned the evidence, you found it and you abandoned it, now they're asking you for a statement. You could say, oh, and by the way, I didn't tell anyone that day or any of my superiors that I found a whole bullet, but I left it back at Parkland, because you don't know what's been found or what's been done with that. So I understand why he then kept quiet. But what's interesting is those statements, those early contemporaneous statements, don't mention the fact that he says he found 2 or saw 2 fragments of bullets inside the car, that he left those inside. So he said, I was worried about what would happen with this bullet if it was left in the car, because maybe there were people gathering around and we, the Secret Service, were going into the hospital and the car was going to be unguarded. Not true. I mean, if you look at pictures at Parkland, there were Dallas police all around that car from the moment it gets there. So there was security. There were no public wandering over to the car. So if he was concerned about the bullet being safe, if the souvenir hunter was going to pick it up, why wasn't he just as concerned about a bullet fragment or 2 that he had seen inside? He says in the original statement that he leaned over he saw something on the seat. He wanted to bring them back, and it was Mrs. Kennedy's sunglasses. And also he thought it was her lighter. It turned out to be lighter that belonged to Jack Kennedy. He saw those, he picked those up and brought them in. Now, after all these years, he also includes the bullet. So he just omits the bullet for the entire time and then tells this story now. What's fascinating is he doesn't believe it's a conspiracy, although people have taken his story. George, you say, how do the conspiracy people view it? They don't view it as simply as I do or Laura might view it. They view this as the proof of another bullet. So we have the single bullet found on the stretcher, knocks off the stretcher. That's the one that ties to Governor Connally. Now we have evidence of another bullet found by Landis that went into Kennedy's back, the same hole that was the same entrance hole that was marked by the single bullet. It's an amazing shot by Oswald. Goes into the same, there's no extra wound on Kennedy's back, but that doesn't come out because it probably had either from the manufacturer or another problem, a partial gunpowder charge.
I heard that. Yeah.
So it went in and then plopped out in the car. Now, you want to have a magic bullet, that's the real magic bullet. So I'm saying, people can go into contortions on this. They can think they're at a Cirque du Soleil act and they're going to put them out to every possible pretzel to explain it, but it doesn't prove an additional shooter, that's for sure.
And nothing about it has changed your perspective, certainly, on where the shots originated from the rear. Now, where he found that bullet does not contradict that. It reinforces it, correct?
Well, he says he found it on the high portion of the rear seat. So everyone says, wow, that's amazing. How did that happen? How did the bullet go there if it was in Connally's thigh? 2 things on that. We're now assuming that if he's telling the truth about the bullet, he's accurate in everything else that he's telling. So where he found it precisely, he's remembering 60 years later, that's the spot. I'm not giving much credence to where he says he found it. If he says he found it on Connolly's pants, I'm not going to give much credence to that, because you just can't rely on it. You can't rely on it one way or the other. It's just too old. But what people forget about, I wish we had video of this like we have with the Zapruder film, but if you talk to the agents and the hospital orderlies and the doctor who first responded to the car with the stretchers, they had to get Connolly out. They wanted to get the president out first, but they realized they had to get Connolly out first because they couldn't get the president out over that seat. Connolly is 6'4", 6'5", in a little jump seat. He's crammed in there in the first place. They were not very gentle moving him out. I'm sorry to say, they moved him out as fast as they could. There are 3 people picking him up. They push him up over that jump seat. He's partly his torso into the back seat where the president is. They're getting him out of the car rather roughly, and then they're getting the president out. Could that bullet have popped up and moved around as people are getting out of that car? Absolutely. But we're just speculating at that point.
Yeah. Okay. Before we move off of this and get to some other things, this memory thing that you're talking about, I have firsthand experience with this, and I know Laura's run into it in reporting also when you talk to some people. But my own mother, I mean, and she was very interested in the Kennedy assassination, and maybe 30 years afterwards, she told me one time. She says, "Well, George, I always thought there was something going on the grassy knoll because I saw something in the video or the film." The next day, or when they were showing it on television. And I'm like, Mom, there was no film shot. The Zapruder film didn't hit TV for how long? 10 years, something like that.
Yeah,
But she was convinced, absolutely. She had seen something on the grassy knoll on film the day afterwards. So there you go.
No, it's the pitfalls of memory. I mean, as a sidelight, Trisha and I were in, Trisha, my wife, who's works with me on all the projects. We were in Thailand in 1987. Doing a story about Chinese triads in the heroin business. And at a Thai restaurant in Bangkok, I remember biting into, in the rice, a nail, sort of a rusty nail in the back. It was time for tetanus shots. And I was talking to Trisha about this a couple of years ago. I said, Trisha, you remember when I bit into that nail? And she said, no, it was me who bit into the nail. And I said, what? And I had to go through it. And I said, oh my God, you're right. I had taken that instance, and we were there, and taken her biting into the nail and all the problems that came, and remembered it as myself. Now, at that moment, Trish wasn't around. I was going to tell you that story about me biting into the nail, and I would have sworn under oath that was correct. So I know that memory can get dicey after a few decades goes by.
Well, we've got people watching the show, and a lot of people have questions and comments, and I want to encourage everybody to leave those, and we'll try to get to them here. Now, this is from Mary Knox. She's a frequent viewer of my show, and she's very insightful. She says, none of this stuff seems to play out like the detective movies. Yeah. And I tell people that all the time. We have been brainwashed to believe that the world is a movie. It's television. And the Secret Service is at the top of the list. The FBI and the CIA, we think because they're so good at what they do, that there has to be a conspiracy afoot. I look at it and say, no, they're so bad at what they do that that's probably what resulted. But she says, wouldn't they immediately look for fingerprints on bullets found? Of course, if all this happened as written, there would have been at least 2 fingerprints, Landis and the hospital staffer. Now she's talking about on that bullet, Gerald.
Yeah, no, as a matter of fact, the amazing thing is, so no fingerprints found on that bullet that were recognizable. And you're right, Landis put it in his pocket, then it goes on there. Remember, everybody that handles it by the time that it's found by the his chief engineer at Parkland, until the time that it gets to the FBI, that bullet is handled basically without gloves, time and time again, smeared, everything else, the handling of evidence, terrible. And even if we had, though, fingerprints on it, I'm not sure that would settle it for hardcore conspiracy believers for the following reason. In the sniper's nest, in the 6th floor of the depository from which the assassin fired, there's Oswald's prints on the boxes around, there's a palm print on the rifle, there's a fingerprint on the edge near the guard. There's all types of prints from Oswald, and people dismiss that by saying, "Well, he worked there, so it's not surprising to find fingerprints." And it was his gun, so it's not surprising to find fingerprints. You don't find anybody else's, of course, but so even with fingerprint evidence, it would be great to be able to have that, but we didn't have any off of the single bullet.
Yeah, and I've got this graphic up of the bullet itself. I remember reading in your book that you were quick to point out that this is referred to oftentimes as the pristine bullet. And a lot of people discounted that it was even involved, that it was strictly a plant because it was pristine. But as you can see here, it's not. And different angles, different views, you can see the deformation of this bullet and the scoring of it. Okay, so Mary Knox asked this question also. She said, "This is the bullet that hit Kennedy in the neck." Yes, the first shot, we think, missed. The second shot passed through Kennedy, soft tissue, into Connally. This is the bullet that Landis says that he picked up and put on the gurney. And then the third shot blew off Kennedy's head. Have I got this right?
Yeah, I mean, that's and as Laura said before, the commission had concluded that the first shot hit Kennedy. I think today that David Belin would actually agree that some advances in the quality of examining the Zapruder film and in forensics that they did not have available to the FBI in 1964 might convince him to change his view of that sequence, to think that the first shot, in fact, was the one that missed. But I will say that this bullet, I've examined that at the National Archives. You have to get permission to do it. You have to apply. They have to approve you. We went to Washington and take a look at it. You're not allowed to touch it. It's presented to you, and it's clearly flattened on one side. That's the what you expect when it hits Connally's rib, in which it's going through at that point like 900 feet a second. The key on this is, what do conspiracy theorists say about that bullet? I love this line. They say it's almost pristine. Almost pristine. That's like saying you're almost pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. It's either pristine or it's not. And this is not a pristine bullet. It's in very good condition. I agree. But the key is also not available to the FBI in 64. The FBI fired bullets into the side, the carcasses of sheep and pigs or that, and they came out deformed. So people would say, well, how is it possible then that this bullet went through Kennedy and Connally, inflicted a set of wounds, and emerged in relatively good condition, which it is, and lost very little of its weight? Finally, ballistics people figured that out in the early 90s, and they said it's because of the way it slowed up as it went through the two men. Then they reconstructed experiments in which they took carcasses the size and weight of the governor and the president. They fired bullets at the speeds at which they then estimated would inflict each of those wounds because of the way it tumbles and slows. And you reproduce the single bullet essentially all day long. I have a picture in Case Closed of one of those sessions done in which the bullet comes out in the same condition. So we now understand that the theory that the commission had, which was that the single bullet must have inflicted sets of wounds on both men around frames 224, 225 of the Zapruder film, now it's proven ballistically without any question. And I think that, that's one of the things that conspiracy theorists found so infuriating, that the Warren Commission, after decades, science came forward not to debunk their work, but to confirm it.
Okay, well, we're already halfway over with this show. I want to move along here because there's some other things I wanted to get to, and this is from Gerald Substack again. There were a couple of things in here. Now we talked about that, but and this possibility of this being planted. Okay, this is from this is the ending paragraph, I believe. You write, "I have no doubt that many assassination researchers will jump on the Landis story and turn it into another leg of conspiracy speculation that will outlive some future release of the last file from the National Archives. For me, it might be the answer as to how CE 399, that's the bullet we were looking at, was discovered. I doubt, however, that it will suffice for those who want to believe there was more of a murder of President Kennedy." And now this highlighting is mine. And this gets reported, people talk about it, but to me, this is really significant. A just turned 24-year-old assassin looking for his place in history. And the reason that I highlight that, Gerald, in your book, Case Closed, is all about Oswald, the person. And maybe the biggest thing, besides he was such an odd screw up, oddly raised person with a strange background, he was just a kid. I mean, he was basically 23 years old. There are people that want to place him at the center of this deep, dark CIA secret agent born identity type thing, using frangible paper bullets and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, he didn't know how to drive a car. That's who Lee Harvey Oswald was.
I can't tell you. I mean, Laura grew up in a household where her father had been involved in the most famous murder investigation in modern American history. So she was well aware, I'm sure, at a young age, of Oswald's youthful age. Mm-hmm. Just in October, he turned 24. And it really is people are often surprised by that. He seems somehow older. He seems in his 30s. He seems more involved. They aren't quite aware of what a kid he was. And I often think about that in terms of the assassination, because the Oswald I came to understand, for whatever it's worth, I think that Oswald could have been on the sixth floor of a building in downtown Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev that day. He was ready to throw a cog into the machinery of government. And although he hated the Russians and what they had done to communism, he hated the Americans even more. He was this loose cannon. Would he have grown out of it if November 22nd hadn't taken place in his 30s or 40s? How many times in this country's history we'll never know somebody like a Sirhan has gone to a political event, armed with a pistol, hoping to get near a candidate, armed with the zeal and passion of a 20-something, I'm going to change the world fervor, and turns into a 60-year-old worried about their IRA account and their balances. So I don't know. They're often case assassins, suicide bombers, the acts of terror are with people who are young. They still have that ability to think that they can commit themselves to changing the world. And Oswald was very much about that.
Yeah, this is pre-social media. They're also so young and dumb that they'll have their wife take a picture of them and post something like this, basically. I mean, I think the film was still in the camera. I can't remember if it had been developed or whatever, but who the hell does that? Well, a 23-year-old kid in his backyard with a copy of a Russian newspaper, and this is the rifle, and my God, he used that to kill the president of the United States. Well, I want to keep moving here because I talk these.
And also,
things,
he had a domestic violence history. I mean, think of
yes.
many men who've acted out violently and shot somebody. It turns out that they had a history of abusing an intimate partner.
Excellent point. Yeah. The groundwork was set. Okay, so here's the next one. Talk about this guy, Gerald.
Yeah, Edwin Walker, retired Army general, was running for the governorship of Texas, a right-winger. And Oswald had made Walker bigger than life because Walker had no chance of winning the election. But Oswald was afraid that he was going to be like the next Adolf Hitler. If somebody had stopped Hitler in 1932 before he became chancellor, or maybe in the first year when he was chancellor of Germany, there would have been no World War II and millions dead and no Holocaust. Oswald's thinking he's going to stop Walker from becoming the governor of Texas and becoming this major right-wing political figure. Now, that's his commitment to history. He's willing to shoot at him. He does try to shoot at Walker. He thinks he's killed him, but the bullet gets deflected. Oswald can't see it because of the light, the edge of a window frame, and misses Walker's head by a couple of inches. That's what he's going to go down in the history books for, is murdering Walker. And then he finds out a couple of days before Kennedy's motorcade, when it's printed in the 2 Dallas newspapers, the president's motorcade is going to travel right in front of the building at which he landed a job a month earlier through a friend of his wife. He is given Kennedy essentially on a silver platter. His opportunity to enter the history books is much larger than Walker. It's now JFK.
Yeah, and several things are too coincidental to be coincidences, basically. Same rifle, for one thing. I mean, the ballistics were matched to the rifle. He took a pot shot at this guy, and then he was in wait for him there, kind of strikingly similar to the Kennedy deal. And then he picks up and walks home. I mean, here again is a secret agent that can't drive, doesn't have a car, doesn't have any money or whatever. He walks home after taking a shot at Walker. I think he thought that he'd hit him. And he did the same thing after the Kennedy assassination. He just told people he thought there wasn't going to be any more work, with the lamest excuse in the world, after Kennedy was shot right in front of his building. And he takes off on foot, tries to get on a bus, in a cab or whatever. It's, again, too coincidental to be a coincidence.
And there's something about this. Walker, the only reason we know about Walker is because of Marina. Marina produced the notebooks and everything she knew about Walker. She was so worried that Oswald was going to try to shoot Walker again. That's why they moved to New Orleans for the summer of '63, because she wanted him away from Walker. When Oswald can't get to Mexico, he can't get to Havana in late September. He gets rejected in Mexico City by the Cubans and the Soviet mission. He comes back dejected to Dallas. He starts to go to Walker rallies. Marina's worried again that he might reactivate on Walker. And we talk about him trying to kill Walker and killing JFK. We leave out of that often the murder of J.D. Tippit, a Dallas policeman who he killed in front of nearly a dozen witnesses who identified him exactly with a pistol right after the assassination as he's fleeing to some place we'll never know because we never found out.
And
Yeah,
thank
Laura, I've
you
heard
for
you talk about
mentioning
that.
Officer Tippit. That's my dad always wanted to make sure that Officer Tippit was mentioned in any conversations about this. And when Oswald was apprehended, he had the gun on him that was used to kill Officer Tippit. And as you mentioned, there were several eyewitnesses who were very close to where that happened. And one of them was a taxi driver who got out of the cab and started running because he was afraid that the gunman was basically going to hijack his cab and force him to drive him somewhere.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Laura, because one of the things is people like to use the word that Oswald used when he was in custody, say, I'm just a patsy.
Mhm.
And I say, if somebody's a patsy, if they've been set up for a crime, the evidence has been left around so that they'll be charged and convicted. They don't even know what happened to them. It's like being run over by a freight train. The next thing they know, they're convicted and they're serving their life in jail saying, I'm not guilty, but they've been completely set up. There's no reason that you would ever kill a patsy because the patsy's going to take the fall for the crime.
Mhm.
But Oswald doesn't act like a patsy after the assassination. Let's say for a second that he had nothing to do with the shooting of Kennedy in terms of pulling the trigger. It was his rifle. He clearly brought it in the night before. He brought in the assassination rifle. And after the president's murder, as George said a moment ago, all of the employees stay there except for one, Lee Harvey Oswald, who takes the first time ever a taxi. And that's a big deal because he doesn't have much money left to his name, but he tried to get moving fast. And when that was stuck, he then took a bus, goes back to his rooming house and collects his pistol. And then when a cop stops him based on this all points bulletin, he shoots him point blank and empties his revolver at him. All of that is evidence of flight. So I don't care what somebody wants to say about Oswald. He was involved in some way in this assassination day because the minute it's over, he's fleeing and he's willing to commit murder. So
Mhm.
people who say he's completely innocent, he's this poor patsy, I think that to me is the most infuriating part because it really turns history on its head.
Let me bring this up on screen because I think I learned this term from reading Gerald actually, but Occam's razor. To talk about this, Gerald, and how it applies to the Kennedy assassination.
Well, it's sort of the theory that a lot of us use in journalism, which is you have a complex case and you're looking at every possibility and you're investigating whether it's this Byzantine conspiracy or this group of plotters. Sometimes you find that it is a really elaborate plot behind an event, and sometimes the simplest explanations and the simplest facts explain it. And people refuse to accept that. They sort of hold on to the more elaborate ideas of what may have happened. They want to believe that there was something more than just this 24-year-old sociopathic loser in life who ended Camelot, ended the best and the brightest, and all this potential for the future. They can't quite accept that it's not something more than that. But anybody who does work on history or reporting or whatever else knows Occam's razors is often true. The simple explanation is sometimes the right one.
I think there is a great resistance to believe that one mediocre person can change history. And an example I like to give is the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Imagine if that had succeeded. And would anybody believe that somebody shot the president because he was trying to impress an actress he was obsessed with? I mean, that just wouldn't make any sense, right? It would have to be the air traffic controllers, or I mean, there would be any number of people who would have an interest, but it didn't. I mean, Reagan was not mortally wounded. And so people just kind of accept that and move on that happened. But I
Yeah.
mean, that is much more fanciful than the idea that Oswald killed President Kennedy.
It's true, but Laura, I think and there are a couple factors. You're absolutely right. There's still been all types of the things though that make it somewhat more prone to conspiracy on JFK is that as opposed to Hinckley or Sirhan, coming up as we're used to an assassin, they start World War I by killing the Archduke with a pistol in their hand and they're tackled at the scene. You may not know if they're doing it for a plot, but you know who the shooter is. In Kennedy, for the first time in modern history, and later we had it with Martin Luther King, you have an assassin's bullet from a long range, from a high-powered rifle. It conjures up all the ideas of Dave the Jackal, professional assassin. Then the assassin gets away in the immediate aftermath of the murder, as Oswald does, but he's caught, a couple of hours later. But you're sort of some doubt about that. And then that assassin is killed 2 days later in police custody by a guy who's out of central casting, looking like he's trying out for a mobster role in a movie. So I understand that given all of the circumstances around it, and then Oswald's odd history of having, having defected to the Soviet Union, having come back here, trying to get to Cuba and in the middle of the Cold War. The basis, what your father and the rest of the Warren Commission did was a great piece of work, but it was very hard to work against what I call that natural inclination to think there was something else going on.
Well, I mean, my father himself, of course, this would have been long before he had any imagination that he would ever even be on the Warren Commission. But when Jack Ruby killed Oswald, everybody thought that that happened to silence the assassin. I mean, my dad thought that himself. That was just because that otherwise that didn't make sense. How was he able to get so close to him in a police station with a gun and so on?
I
So
agree.
that was thoroughly that Jack Ruby was not the main area that my father was investigating on the Warren Commission. But I mean, they looked really hard at that because it certainly did look like it was part of a conspiracy. And then some of the mistakes the Warren Commission made, not releasing the autopsy report. And there were other things that some of the staff attorneys fought against. The secrecy then added to the air of possible conspiracy.
Yeah, and I do think that people forget all these years later that the Kennedy family was still revered afterwards. Bobby Kennedy was still Attorney General. Jackie Kennedy had gone through this tremendous loss and had been strong for the nation, and she stood there with her children during the funeral. They did not want the assassination to be made into some gruesome side display. They were not in favor of releasing the autopsy photos or including them in the Warren report. And the Warren Commission went along in part in deference to them. It wasn't just because they decided to hide the information. There was this very personal, when the autopsy was being performed, which is not the greatest autopsy in the world, agreed, the autopsy doctors are getting calls from higher up in Bethesda. It's the Attorney General and the First Lady who are waiting to find out when it's going to be over. It's a lot of pressure on that. So, that was taking place as well. And I think that, people do forget about that. I thought also, when I started to look into the case in the early 90s, that Ruby's murder of Oswald meant it was likely a mob silencing. And then I found out, as I did the research, that wasn't the case.
Well, and you're not alone because the great Suzanne Murphy has joined us. And that was the question that she had. And she says, what about Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner who gets access to Oswald, who may have revealed much more had he not been killed? Okay, Oswald would have revealed much more if he had not been killed. That part is a little neat for me. Well, I mean, that is one of the great tragedies of history that Jack did that. But I look at him just, again, based on what I read from Gerald and other people. There's a nightclub owner down in Dallas, a thug, a brute, a guy that's his own bouncer that takes matters into his own hands. He's mentally unstable. He's got a friendship going with the police department. He can walk in and out anytime that he wants to. He shows up for Oswald's transfer when he's coming out of his cell, and Oswald's being transferred an hour and a half late. It was just a coincidence. That Ruby was there. And the fact that Ruby had any part of a conspiracy to silence Oswald or that they knew each other and all that kind of stuff, to me, this is one of the least interesting parts of this, Gerald.
But George and Laura, the Warren Commission, your father, Laura, they were served well by the FBI in many cases of the investigation, but then poorly served in other areas. And one area in which the FBI held information back, much to the detriment of this story on Ruby, is the FBI had placed a couple of years before the assassination an illegal wiretap into the headquarters of the Chicago Mafia, Sam Giancana and the Chicago Mob, placed by an agent called Bill Romer at the direction of the director. They knew it was illegal. They could never use it in court, but they wanted to know what the mob was talking about. The mob didn't know the FBI even knew where their headquarters was. Once in a while, the mobsters, it's fantastic material, it didn't come out until the 70s. They would sit around the table and say, by the way, do you think this place could be bugged by the feds? They would call in a guy to sweep it, and the FBI would break back in, take the listing equipment out, the place would be swept, and they would put it back in. The reason it's so critical is because after the assassination, those mobsters, including Giancana, they don't know they're being listened to, and they're talking about the case like every other American. What happened? Who killed Kennedy? What happened? And when Ruby kills Oswald, they're all saying, hey, somebody says that guy's from Chicago. He is? You know him? No. Do you know him? Who is he? So Jack Ruby is supposed to be sent by the Chicago Mafia to go ahead and kill Kennedy. If those tapes had been available to the Warren Commission, it would have been fantastic to show that the mob itself knew nothing about Ruby. They weren't revealed because they were still doing the illegal wiretapping at that point, which is unfortunate. So I often say that the FBI and the CIA poorly served the commission to protect sometimes their own interests. The CIA didn't want the commission to know they were trying to kill Fidel Castro together with the mafia, and they didn't tell them.
Well, George already alluded to the one thing about Jack Ruby is that Oswald should have been transferred before Jack Ruby even got downtown. I mean, he was downtown because he needed to do a wire transfer to a dancer in his club, and the only Western Union office that was open on a Sunday was downtown. And then there was a postal inspector who normally went to church on Sunday, but he decided to go down and participate in the interrogation of Oswald. The postal inspector was involved because the purchase of the rifle that had happened through the mail. So there was a mail fraud angle to it. So in any case, Postal Inspector Holmes' questioning extended the interrogation and delayed the transfer of Oswald. So I mean, Ruby shouldn't have even been there, been on the scene, and had the capacity to do that. But he was a guy, he hung out with a lot of cops. He hung out with a lot of reporters. You wouldn't involve this guy in your conspiracy, because from other things I've read about him, I mean, he was a total blabbermouth. He liked to brag about his involvement and the people he knew. So, I mean, he just wasn't a likely hired assassin at all. But I mean, it is very unfortunate that all of that played out that way, because and that there wasn't able to be a trial of Oswald.
You know, there was a statute in Texas at the time called murder without malice. Real Texas statute. You could kill somebody, but you didn't have malice about killing them. You could only serve 5 years max. Ruby thought that that's what he would get. But you know, Laura, I've talked to so many conspiracy people over time. I found out they have an answer for everything. So when I say what you just said, Ruby Oswald should have been transferred an hour before. They say, "Oh, you fool, Posner." They, meaning the secret they were going to hold Oswald until Ruby arrived. There'd be another excuse. So it was the postal inspector. He was changing his clothes. Then they would say, "Oh, I forgot to change my shoes. Oh, I have to call my wife." They were going to wait until Jack got there. So even if it had been 2:00 in the afternoon, they were going to wait to bring him out until Jack was ready to kill him. That, of course, you can't answer. That's just, that's Oliver Stone's speculation.
Right. We're running out of time here. I promised Gerald that we would get him to his next appointment here. And maybe we'll end with this, Gerald. And I started this way when I talked about, the Walter Cronkite thing. And Gerald and I, not so much Laura, but we're a dying breed. I mean, the people that are old enough to remember this, and just barely with us. But do you think that there's going to be some bombshell before we're gone, for instance? Or is this just where it's going to land, do you think, even with the release of the final archives and all that stuff?
Well, I mean, a third of the country now thinks that, in a public opinion poll 6 months ago, that it's Oswald alone. People thought that was a low number. Laura will know that's pretty high. It was down to 5% after JFK's the film by Stone. So I think as time goes along, there's no deathbed confession. Nobody's coming out with the last moment. Paul Landis is the biggest surprise of where he might have put the single bullet. That people will start to think, maybe it really just was one person. We're never going to reach a consensus on it. I understand that. There's too much false information, too many conspiracy theories that are there forever. But I do think there is a truth to tell about the case. The Warren Commission told it a year afterwards. And some of us have years later come back and said, yeah, this is what happened in the case. The underlying conclusion is that it is still unshakable 60 years later. One lone assassin for his own warped motivations killed the president on November 22nd, 1960.
Yep, and the 60th anniversary is coming up, folks. I'm going to let him go. Laura, I want you to stick around because I got a little film clip here that I want to play if you've got time. But I'm going to let Gerald go to his next appointment.
And I do recommend, if the people watching, if you haven't read Case Closed, you really should read Case Closed. It's one of the best books. My father thought very highly of it, and it really is an outstanding look at the assassination.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think people are willing to watch a 3-hour movie like Stone's JFK. Reading a book of 700 pages, that's a bigger task, but hopefully some will. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say this: there goes Gerald on his way. That book is like reading a movie. I mean, we're not talking about some text that's difficult to get through or something. It is a page turner. I mean, Gerald is an outstanding book author. I mean, my God, get that book and you will be glad that you did. And here's another book. We didn't get a chance to talk about this. Now, I showed it on screen, and I just wanted to end here talking about Laura's father and his work, because I mean, this was something that was a big part of your dad's life, Laura, and it wasn't easy. Talk about that.
So this book is sort of laid out as if there had been a trial of Oswald. This would be the evidence the prosecution would have presented from the Warren Commission. So there are a lot of excerpts from the depositions, the interviews explaining the ballistic evidence. This was something my father wrote in time for the 10th anniversary. And it is really interesting. I mean, the eyewitness testimony, and it's not even just decades later, people remember things differently. When you have an event that was witnessed by hundreds of people, people do remember it differently. But there were eyewitnesses. Howard Brennan was one who actually saw the gunman fire from the 6th floor of the books depository. Also, as I mentioned, there were eyewitnesses who saw Oswald kill Officer Tippit, and that is all presented in the book that you have on screen. Another book that I referenced it briefly earlier, but Philip Sheenan's book, A Cruel and Shocking Act, that came out in 2013 in time for the 50th anniversary. And it is a lot about the assassination. A lot of it is almost a history of the Warren Commission. It was quite interesting. I learned things about the Warren Commission. I am fairly certain that Philip Sheenan reported on some things that even my father wasn't aware of. So that is also really worth reading as one of the books. There's such a you could almost fill a library with books about the Kennedy assassination, but those are a couple of the really good ones.
Well, you could, and you hit on something. Now, your father, these books were written early on. This wasn't to make money with, but there's a huge cottage industry that's
all of the proceeds from books related to the assassination. All the proceeds he donated to charity, and that was something
that's cool.
He mentioned in interviews. Yes, he did not. He didn't go on a tour. He wasn't paid hefty speakers fees to talk about the assassination. I mean, he really felt like this was important to talk about what the Warren Commission did, and this was not something he profited off of. Of course, there was a huge industry of many people profiting. Oliver Stone, probably chief among them, but I mean, hundreds of people, frankly, profited off the assassination.
Yeah, and I wish more people got their understanding of history from well-written, documented texts like this, and fewer from fictional or nearly fictional accounts like Oliver Stone's movie. I almost want to give him a pass sometimes. My God, people, it's a movie. But then again, research has shown most Americans get their understanding of history from movies.
And then when they released the movie, he had a study guide that he tried to distribute in high schools across the country. So he certainly wasn't presenting his movie as a fictionalized account. He was presenting it as this is exactly what happened. And I mean, the version, I mean, he was pulling all kinds of things from different conspiracy theories. So there was not even any internal coherence to what's in his movie, besides the fact that so much of it could be disproved by a lot of the evidence that it was in the Warren report. But it's time consuming. I mean, it takes a few seconds to throw something out and then to try to explain why that isn't really the case, or why the other evidence refutes that. I mean, it's very difficult to do.
I wanted to show this here. Maybe this would be a good way to end. I do have a film clip. I'm going to show that. There he is, man. There's David Belin. That's a great photo of him. It's amazing to look back on these things. Well, this is great, Laura. I appreciate you joining us with Gerald, because I know he always appreciates having you on the show, because he's a big fan of your father's work, as am I. And we got to wrap up here today. But anything in closing that you want to say about this, or anything?
I just want to say, I do understand why a lot of people have trouble believing that there could have been, that Oswald was the lone gunman. And there are a lot of questions. And there are a couple of things that my father often mentioned. One was that when Oswald was being interrogated, he lied about everything that was related to the assassination, and he told the truth about everything that was inconsequential. And so he lied about owning the gun. He lied about using the pseudonym A.J. Hiddell and so on. And he also lied about that trip to Mexico City. So, I mean, my father always thought that it could be that things happen in Mexico City that they never truly got to the bottom of. But one thing that they did conclusively prove was that he was the lone gunman. Now, to prove that nobody else influenced him in developing this plot, that would be very difficult to prove a negative. But there was no person on the grassy knoll. There was no second gunman. And the other thing is, and I did mention this earlier, and I just want to repeat, my father going into the Warren Commission, he wasn't going in there thinking, okay, we're just going to sweep this under the rug and prove that Oswald acted alone. That was not what they were doing. Most of them thought that there was likely a conspiracy. He was thinking he's an ambitious 35-year-old lawyer.
Yes.
Solve the crime of the century, this is going to make his career, right? So they did not go into it trying to have some sort of whitewash. And I just want people to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, and that's well said. There are so many different angles of this thing that I didn't have time to get to on the show. We never do. And one of them is, again, the idea that Oswald was a conspirator. That was kind of the essence of Gerald's book. This was a guy that was friendless, that not a networker. Let's say he'd grown up extremely strange, bounced around from community to community. This was not your guy. This was not your secret agent that would do this type of thing. And the other point that I want to make up, now there's so many like these little Rosetta Stones, they're called with this case, is Robert Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. Now, maybe they weren't very close, but they were brothers. And Robert Oswald, his brother, after he talked to Oswald, he was interviewed and he said, "Oh, yeah, he did it." I mean, who knew him better than his own brother? He says, "I looked in his face, I look in his eyes, regardless of what he says, Lee did it." I mean, that's from his own brother. My God.
Well, and my father, the Rosetta Stone was exactly the phrase he used about the Tippit murder, that he thought the Tippit
Yes.
murder was really the key to proving, as Gerald mentioned, he was fleeing. I mean, if you were just set up and you had nothing to do with this, you would not go get your gun and then shoot the first cop who stops you on the street. So
Yeah.
there was nothing about his behavior following the assassination that suggested this is an innocent person who had no connection to it.
Yeah, and he was, to go back to your point about lying copacetically in the police department, he was a liar like a dead man walking. I mean, he was lying about things that could very easily be turned around and proven against him, but he had nothing to lose. He had lost it all. "Is this your gun?" "No, I don't own a gun." Well,
Right.
my God, they could prove that the man owned a gun. He had to know that. He ran out of there and shot a police officer dead on the street for simply stopping him to question him. And then when he was in the Dallas theater and they were apprehending him, he tried to kill cops in there too. Now, who
Right.
does that?
Well, and of
With
course, the
yeah,
movie, the JFK movie doesn't show that he had a gun on him when he was apprehended. They make it look like it's just he has no
yeah,
idea what's going on. He was just in the theater. But yeah, the conspiracy theorists, like Gerald was saying, they have an answer for everything, right? Like there's a photo of him holding the gun in his yard. Well, they say that the negative was doctored and that, or whatever. They forged the film. I mean, it's difficult to answer, and we consume a lot of popular culture that does talk about these elaborate conspiracies in government. I mean, it would be very difficult to hold together. Think about the number of people who would have had to be involved for all of this time to make this work. That would be very difficult to engineer. And again,
yeah.
Jack Ruby, not your person. I think there's some in Gerald's book, but even more in Philip Sheenan's book. Jack Ruby's not your guy if you're part of a grand conspiracy and you're looking for someone to silence the assassin.
Yeah, a couple of comments here as we close. Now, this is from Suzanne Murphy. Man, I love Suzanne Murphy. She says, "Thanks for presenting another point of view. I've long accepted we won't have all the answers, and many capitalize on perpetuating conspiracies. Never believed he was a patsy or entirely innocent. Entirely innocent. My point of it is that I made at the top. If you are of this dying breed, this generation, like I am, and you believe this, and you started to believe this beginning in third grade, that dark, shadowy conspirators in our government are behind these types of things, and they're so skilled and efficient that they can conceal and hide and complete these kinds of things, and the Oliver Stone type movies. Think of how you view the world today. Everything else in the world. Think of how significant this is. And here is from Mary Knox. She says, "I think I remember Bobby's assassination. I recall the funeral. My mom was crying. She loved Bobby." I wanted to ask you this, Laura, because nobody's more knowledgeable about politics than you are. What if these guys had lived? I mean, I know that you must have given that some thought. Some people say, well, they were just talkers. They weren't walkers. They would, and they made great speeches, but they wouldn't have been able to follow through on them. Things maybe would have unfolded the same way that they did in Vietnam and elsewhere. What do you think would have happened if
I am
JFK and
not
Bobby, yeah,
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the history of the 1960s. I will say one of my friends who did go on and study, he had as a doctorate in American history. He said the idea that Kennedy would have kept us out of Vietnam, he thinks is very fanciful. I mean, we were already in the process of escalating, and he does not believe that. Also, I mean, there's many people doubt whether Kennedy could have gotten some of the agenda. I mean, LBJ was so skilled. He had come out of Congress. He really was very aggressive in getting members of Congress to pass things. And many people question whether Kennedy could have gotten, let's say, the Civil Rights Act or some of the other legislation that created Medicaid, whether that could have gotten through Congress if he had lived. I mean, I think unquestionably it's a huge tragedy for the country that the president was killed. I would say that about any president, and it really did. It changed a lot of things about culture. But it changed what people believe the government is capable of and conspiracies are capable of. So, certainly, I wish it had never happened. I don't know how much it would have changed the course of the 1960s. That really isn't my area of expertise.
Well, like with our regular shows that you and I do, I always like to give you the last word here as we wrap up. Anything that we haven't covered or haven't touched on, or just to promote bleedingheartland.com, go there. Yeah. Thanks, Laura.
I appreciate it. I wish my father had lived to see the pendulum
Yes.
back a little and at least see that there are more people now who do believe that Oswald was the lone gunman. It was the 1990s were kind of the peak of the conspiracy industry, and it was frustrating for my father. The other members of the Warren Commission were not as public in defending the Warren Commission's conclusions. So I know that he would have appreciated that other people put so much research into this as well. But in any case, it's a treat for me to be able to be on the show talking about it with one of the leading experts.
Yeah, and that pendulum swings now, the conspiracy versus not. And like you say, it was swinging back. What about the Landis revelation and this bullet and the fact that
Well,
somebody
like
could.
I said, when I read about that and my siblings, we talked about it. Of course, like my father would have been horrified that that wasn't revealed to them at the time. And
Yeah.
they didn't have a chance to properly investigate and interview him at the time. That it was, there were a lot of frustrations, and Philip Sheenan's book does get into a lot of the frustrations and the disagreements within the Warren Commission on how much they should do. There was never a thorough interview with Jackie Kennedy out of respect for the president's widow, but honestly, she was the eyewitness to a crime. So there were just a lot of things that weren't handled well and disagreements about how the Warren Commission could proceed. I still think there would have been a conspiracy industry, because the bottom line is people don't want to believe that somebody like Oswald changed the course of history. That is the bottom line. And unfortunately, there were some mistakes made during the process of the investigation, but that the conclusion they reached was the correct one, that Oswald was the lone gunman.
Yeah, and again, my overarching thing here with the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, and that type of thing, and Paul Landis's revelations and all that. It's not a movie, folks. We're not living in a storybook. Reality is these people are human. They're fallible. They make mistakes. They screw up. Copacetically, they cover their tracks when they're found out to have screwed up. And that's, to me, that's what happened here. Laura, thanks again for coming on this podcast by George Live.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a treat.
It really was a lot of fun. So, folks, let me end this way, like I always do. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up now if you haven't already for the live streams, the video live streams like this with Gerald Posner, a Pulitzer-nominated author. Case Closed is his book. You can see this off my left side here. These are the kind of guests that I have on the show. The great Laura Belin from Bleeding Heartland, she's on regularly. And you can see and hear us each time live on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter when these shows are released. And you can also, at podcastbygeorge.com, sign up for the repurposed audio-only versions, the audio podcasts that appear on Spotify and the iHeartRadio app and Apple Podcasts and places like that. But folks, that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for today. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.